Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm Sean from Crafted Elements, and today I'm going to be talking about our charcuterie board silicone molds and doing some actual full projects. You can see just how beneficial they may be to you. So right here I've got our entire current collection of charcuterie board molds. It is August 2022, so depending on when you're watching this video, it may be more or less, probably more. But I want to talk about them really quickly before we actually get into the meat and potatoes of this video, which is actually making some projects. So first of all, these molds are going to allow you to create pre-shaped, almost finished charcuterie boards out of solid resin or resin and wood. So compared to, say, using a rectangular mold, finishing that, having to cut it out by hand or use a template or a CNC machine or whatever, these are going to basically save you that time and money. Time because you don't have to do all the shaping and cutting and thinking of what you're going to make that board look like, and money because you're obviously going to be saving materials. If you make a rectangular, 24-inch by 12-inch rectangle and then cut this out of it, you're wasting a lot of wood and you're wasting a lot of resin. So that's one of the reasons why these things are so beneficial. And of course, if you're a resin artist who is only working with resin, not putting wood in here, well, that's pretty much a no-brainer. These are going to give you solid resin pieces, typically 1 inch to 1.5 inches thick. They're very durable, very heavy, and very deep. So really there's no comparison, when you're talking about these things to something like a $15 or $20 mold for like a serving tray or something like that you could find on Amazon. Now going from left to right, or my right to my left, we're going to talk about these boards individually. We have our simple paddle mold, so it's a rectangular shape and a paddle handle. We've got our 4-glass beer flight / wine flight mold. So basically it's very similar to that paddle mold, but we've got 4 different circular divots, essentially 3 inches, which will create pockets in your resin. This is probably something you'd use more with solid resin rather than resin and wood, simply because it's kind of hard to work the wood around here, but we do have matching templates for every single one of these things, so you can pre-cut wood to fit them exactly. We have our razor, which is a really fun shape. It's kind of like an edgy, kind of like a rock guitar, if you really think about it. You've got a lot of crazy angles and stuff there. One of our most popular is our organic handle molds. We've got a large version and a small version. This is like 25-inch tall. This is like 18 inches tall. Very cool organic handle. And if you've seen those on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, it's probably using our mold. This is our free flow, which is kind of a newer one. It's really popular. Again, it's kind of got that organic look to it. Slopes off to the side. This one's 1 inch deep. One of our newer molds, and one I'm going to be using today in this demonstration video, is our flared oval. So it's got a flared, kind of stretched oval handle. It's got some angled sides and then a flared bottom and top. We've got our fishtail mold. Pretty obvious, right? Fish or mermaid tail, and it flares out to the sides. This is the only mold we don't have a template for. This is our 18 by 12 mold, which is basically a rectangle, but it's got those 2 integrated handles, so you can actually make a tray. We've got circular molds with handles. So this is our 19-inch tall, I think it's 14-inch diameter, so it won't fit in a regular planer. But this one will. This is a 12-inch diameter, and I think it's like 14.5-inch tall. So these are circular molds with handles. And then this big boy over here is our Romeo and Juliet mold, which is based on our Romeo and Juliet templates that we came up with first. And we basically saw that the templates were selling really well, so we created a mold out of it. It will literally allow you to create a nesting set. So you can create 2 boards that literally interlock together to create 1 board. So that is our entire line of molds. Now, one of the things that we get asked frequently is, well, how do you cut the wood to fit into these things? It's only beneficial if you could fit the wood exactly. Well, glad you asked that question, because that is what our line of templates is for. Every single one of these molds, other than this one, has a matching template. So for example, if you wanted to cut a piece of wood to fit this handle around this handle, we have a template for that. So you pre-cut the wood and insert it into there. And of course, I'm going to show you how to do this in just a couple of minutes. One of the molds I'm using today, again, exact. And by the way, these are clear acrylic. I left the paper on so you can see it on the video. But they're clear acrylic templates. And I'm going to show you how to use them along with these molds right now. Now, if you have any questions about these molds, or you want to shop these molds, you want to get them for yourselves, and you don't want to see the video, you just want to get going on your project, completely understand. CraftedElements.com is where you can get these. Otherwise, stay with me and we'll get a couple of boards built. So these are the 2 molds that we've selected for today's project. These are 2 of our newer molds. We've got our 12-inch diameter circular mold with handle, And we've got our flared oval mold, which is kind of a cool shape. And I've got the matching templates, so I can pre-cut the wood to fit the mold exactly. Now, heads up, you do not 100% need these templates. These templates will make your job easier. You can pre-shape and pre-cut wood to fit in here, but of course this is a straight edge. You could easily take a straight piece of wood and kind of estimate this curve. So 100% you do not absolutely need the templates, but I guarantee it'll make your job easier, and that's why we offer them. You'll just have a nice tighter finish around these molds. So the first thing I'm going to do before I get started with the wood, because these are silicone molds, is we're going to apply a mold release. Now, don't let anyone ever tell you that you do not need a mold release for silicone molds. Don't care where you buy your silicone molds, whether it's from us or a competitor or Etsy or Amazon. Epoxy resin is generally corrosive to silicone. The chemicals in it, the heat generated in it, it will always eventually wear down the silicone molds. Using something like this, the MG Chemicals 8329, there's a few others that we do recommend, will help protect that mold, and you'll get a longer life out of them, and you won't get like mold tear out and stuff like that. Eventually these molds will all fail, 20, 30, whatever uses down the road, as long as you're using this stuff. But that's a big difference between not using this and only getting a couple uses out of these molds, which is going to be really expensive. Cost per board is going to be really expensive if you can only use them twice. So yes, mold release is imperative, and it's a non-silicone based mold release. Do not use pan, do not use butter, do not use cooking spray. Use a non-silicone based mold release. All right, I'm going to quickly apply that so we can let it dry, and then we'll continue with the rest of this job. I'm going to set those to a side because you want to leave the mold release to dry. 5-10 minutes will be fine. And while that's drying, and I can continue with the rest of this project, which is cutting this wood to fit those molds and mixing our epoxy. So I have here a couple of pieces of ambrosia maple or wormy maple. Never really been able to tell the difference, but I always get corrected in my videos, so feel free to comment below. Ambrosia wormy maple, okay? I've already planed it down. I've milled it off of an 1.5 inch thick piece, and I planed it down to about 1 inch because these molds are 1 inch thick. And I've cut it in half, so I've got this piece. I'm going to create a board. I'm going to create basically half of it with wood, half with resin, including the handle. And this one I'm going to do a more conventional river table style. So I'm going to have wood on both sides and then a channel through the middle. So the first thing you're going to want to do is trace your line onto the wood. Line up how you want your final board to look like. That's the great thing about having these clear templates, is because you know exactly what it's going to look like because you've got that shape of your finished product, right? So I'm not going to go into the handle because we don't have the length, but we'll probably just end it there. Keep a piece of that there, and we'll just rough trace this. So what we're doing is we're obviously tracing it, but we're going to rough cut it. Now, if you don't want to use a router table to do your final trim, then you could take this over to a bandsaw or scroll saw or whatever and do like a really, really nice job of it. But personally, I'm not that good with a bandsaw or scroll saw to be able to make this circle perfectly flat and 90 degrees and smooth. So we get a rough cut around the edge just to take most of that meat off, and then we'll finish it up with the router table. Doing the same thing over here. We're going to cut this in, let's cut this in half first. We can line this up exactly. So we'll figure out what the maximum kind of length is there. We'll cut this in half with our saw, then we'll line it up. All right, so cut that in half and line it up approximately how we want it. You want to keep the same sides, the faces up. And you want probably mostly wood, less epoxy, and we want the epoxy handles. So I think that looks pretty good. And again, we are going to take these pieces over to our saw, whether it be a jigsaw or a bandsaw or a scroll saw or a table saw, whatever you're going to use, and cut them out roughly before we run them through our router table. All right, so we're going to use this piece and we're going to use this piece. This is gone, this is gone. And of course, this is not scrap, right? We can use this wood for future projects. We can create other trinkets out of it, whatever. There's a lot of things you can do with these nice solid pieces of wood offcuts, whether it be mixing with the resin or wood. You can make coasters out of them. You can make a small charcuterie board out of them. They are not waste, so don't throw them out. Anyway, we're going to go over to saws and we're going to cut these pieces out. So we've brought our pieces that we've rough cut over, and you'll see what I mean here. So here's our trace line, and we've got roughly 1/8 of an inch all around, 1/8 to a 16th to an 1/8 of meat left over, of wood left over, and we're actually going to get rid of that with the help of our router table. So we're going to use the router template along with a router bit like this. So we're going to be able to take the rest of that off with our 1/4 inch flush trim router bit. This is a bit from Amanda Tool, but you can of course get flush trim router bits pretty much at any tool supply store, online store, Amazon, etc. So we're going to go ahead and glue our template temporarily to each piece of wood. You can use two-sided carpenter's tape. You can use the masking tape and CA glue method. You can use this hot glue method. The key is that you want to make sure that that template's not going anywhere and that wood's not going anywhere when you run it through your router. So I'm going to go ahead and put a decent amount of glue on here and then set down my template right onto that wood. And I'll do the same over here. So my router table actually already has a flush trim router bit installed in it, so I'm not going to go ahead and switch out this bit for the Amanda one. They work the same. This one's a little bit wider. I think it's like a 5/16 or something like that. It'll do fine for this particular profile. And we want to line up that router bit bearing to be in line with the router template. So you can see what's going to happen is that bearing's going to ride against that router template and the blade's going to take off all the material. So the trick to doing this is you want to go in the direction opposite the spin. So this is going to spin this way. So we're going to want to router like this. We don't want to router, from the opposite direction. We want to go against the blade, and you want to start at the position that you have the least amount of wood. So I've got like a 1/16 of wood there compared to almost a 1/4 inch there. If I started here and just rammed it in there, we'll probably get a lot of router kickback, and the thing will go, not flying, but it'll make a kind of a nasty jump. So if we start here, we'll probably end up with a much cleaner finish and it'll be easier to get through. Just a couple of little tips there. I'm gonna go ahead and turn this bad boy on. So after running those pieces through our router table, that just came right off. That one just came right off. We'll just take the rest of the glue off the wood. And as long as it hasn't been sitting for hours or days, it usually comes off pretty easily with a scraper. And any remnant that might be left on there, not a big deal, because you're going to run your piece through the planer once you actually pull it out of the mold. So it's not that big of a deal if you've got a little bit of remnants left on there. And again, this was just one hold down method. You could use two-sided tape, carpenter's tape. You could do your own kind of two-sided tape version, which is using masking tape on both sides and the CA glue between them to effectively create your own two-sided tape. A lot of different ways you can hold those templates down to the wood. Most important is that they're secure no matter which way you do it, so it doesn't run off on you when you run it through the router. All right, put our templates aside because we are now done with them for this project. Of course, they are reusable, and you can also use those templates to create solid wood pieces. Even if you didn't have these molds, if you wanted to create a piece of wood that matched that template, those templates are, of course, really handy to do that as well. So if you're making a solid wood charcuterie board or whatever, you can use any of those templates in our line, and you can get them at craftselements.com. Okay, so both pieces of wood. Grab our molds here, set them up just like this, and we'll have to remember kind of how we line this up. Our mold release is obviously dry now, and we're going to line it up like so. So we got a resin and then a resin handle. And then this one's more of a typical charcuterie board where we have, or a typical river table rather, type style where we have a channel or a river in the middle. And it might be hard to see from this angle, but those are dead flush on those edges. And of course this wood is a little bit over an inch, not a big deal because once I load this up with resin, take them out, we're gonna plane it down to that inch. And that's kind of a trick using these because if you've got a mold that's 1 inch and you want to end up with a board that's really close to 1 inch, you obviously have to plane it down on both sides, so you're gonna lose a little bit. If you use slightly oversized wood and slightly over pour the resin, once you plane it down, you could pretty much end up with like a 7/8 inch thick board, so almost 1 inch. And of course, you don't have to fill it all the way. If you wanted to use these to make a 1/2 inch board or a 3/4 inch board, you could use 1/2 inch wood, 3/4 inch wood, or just fill 1/2 inch or 3/4 inches of epoxy and then plane the rest down. So again, these molds allow you to do up to that 1 inch casting essentially. So now comes the actual fun part that everybody loves, mixing up that resin and pigment, pouring it in the molds, and then we'll wait till tomorrow. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up some Total Boat thick set because it is good for 1 inch thick pours. And thank you for Total Boat for providing us with that material to make these videos. So if you guys are looking for epoxy resin or a new epoxy resin to try, definitely recommend the Total Boat line of products, specifically their Maker Epoxy and thick set. 95% of the time that's what we use here in the shop when we're working on these projects. I'm gonna try out a black diamond pigment I have never tried before. It's called Kiwi. I can't even tell what it is actually. It's almost like a silvery red, sort of brown. I'm not even sure. We're gonna go ahead and try that for this one, see how it turns out. It might be like a chroma color, it might actually have some different colors, pigments in it. In hindsight, it's probably not a color I would find attractive just as a color. I'm not even sure what I'm looking at. All right, we'll pour this guy in here. Yeah, it's very strange. It's got like a red and green at the same time. So it's got sort of like a chroma depth look to it. Very, very odd, very interesting. But anyway, that's the color we mixed, so that's the color we're putting in there. We've over poured that a little bit. You don't have to do that. In fact, if you don't spray the entire thing with mold release, don't do that, because if you didn't put mold release on the top surfaces, you're going to end up possibly ruining that mold. So just be careful when you're over pouring like that. And for this guy, we're going to use a mix of random blue and green to create kind of an aquamarine color, just because I had this pigment kind of left over. It's black diamond, but I'm not sure what the color names are. So I'm going to go ahead and mix it and see how it turns out. We've got the color I was looking for. You've got blues and greens kind of at the same time, depending on how the light hits the angle. So we're going to go ahead and use that in our circular mold. Looks like there's some chunks that were not quite mixed here. And that extra pigment that is not mixed properly, we can just take out or mix in while it's in the mold. All right, I like that color. All right, I've gone ahead and put some weights on top of our wood to prevent it from floating up from the epoxy, buoyancy getting underneath there. You can use these weights or clamps. I pretty much always use these hand weights as a default. I just find them really easy to use. You can also use HDP blocks or stuff that's covered in tuck tape. Really up to you how you want to hold those down. And I have a lot of resin left, and we definitely do not waste resin here. So I grabbed one of our 16 by 12 by 1 molds, threw a random piece of Manitoba maple that I had lying around, and mix both those extra resins together. So now we've got another board that I can chop up into pieces and have another board out of that excess resin. So again, we are going to let this set 24 to 48 hours for the Total Boat Thick Set product over here. And we'll come back, take them out of the molds and plane them down. Okay, so roughly 48 hours has passed since we poured this resin. It's now set. It's not fully cured yet. It will do that over 4 to 5 days, but it's at the point where we can take it out of the mold, demold it, run it through the planer and finish this thing up. I'm going to show you just how easy it is with these silicone molds. Basically 0 effort. You kind of just work around the sides and you end up with clean mold, clean board. We'll come through this guy. Pop that handle section out there. This is the one that we did, kind of just having the leftover resin. This mold has been well used. I've probably used this about 12 or 15 times, but there you go. We've got a piece that we can finish. Now, I'm not going to go finish this piece on camera because this is about charcuterie boards and our pre-finished charcuterie board molds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these over to the planer. I'm going to plane them down. We're going to run them through the router to chamfer the edge, basically add a quarter-inch round over to the perimeter of both these boards. And then we're going to sand them and finish them. Now, a quick tip here before I start routering this out. You notice in some of these sections where the wood wasn't exactly pushed against the silicone wall, you have a little bit, like less than a 32/32 of an inch of resin. Now this you can either sand off, but what I like to do, honestly, is I like to chamfer the edges or router the edges first, because when you do that, you end up curving it and getting rid of a lot of that anyway. So when you go and sand it, you're really just sanding the middle section of the profiled edge. So I'll show you what I mean. And that doesn't happen all the time. Obviously, we templated this piece, but depending on how I lined it and weighed it down, the viscosity of the resin, obviously the thinner the resin, the higher tendency it's going to be to get in between the walls of the mold and the piece of wood. But not a big deal, really easy to fix, and I'll show you how to do that now. So I've just got my round over bit on here, and I think it's a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. I think this is a 3/8 inch round over, so it's obviously going to make a larger profile, take more off, which is obviously going to lead to less sanding of any of this excess that's left here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Remember that you want to run in the opposite direction of your blade spin. So it's going to spin this way, so you want to push it through the rotor this way. If you try going this way, you're just going to end up with a mess, or you're going to send your board the wrong way. So I've sanded these boards to 320 grit. I went from 100, I think 80 or 100 grit to 150 grit, then up to 320. I typically don't do any more than that, but one of the things that commonly comes up, questions that commonly comes up is, how much do I sand the resin to? Where do I stop? And honestly, with sanding and polishing, the sky's the limit. You can get super crystal clear resin, going from 80 grit to 3000 grit, and then polishing and wet sanding and all that stuff. I definitely do not do that with a charcuterie board. It has a limited value, right? I mean, if you're going to spend all that time wet sanding and polishing, I could see doing that for a very expensive river table, but not for a charcuterie board that's going to run anywhere from $100 to $250. It really should be thinking as a woodworker and a business owner. If you're doing this as a hobby, completely up to you. Sand to your heart's content. But if you're going to be selling these things, and you're going to spend an extra hour going from 320 grit all the way to 3000 grit and then wet sanding, what's your time worth per hour? Is it $20 an hour? Is it $50 an hour? Is it $100 an hour? Can you get that $20, $50, or $100 back when you sell the board? So I think that's probably one of the things you should maybe think of. First, I would say on average, I go to 220, sometimes 320 grit, especially if I'm going to be using an oil-based product like the Total Boat Wood Honey to finish them up. Whereas, if you're making a table and you're using something like Rubio Monocoat, you really don't want to go past 120 or 150 grit because you end up closing the grains of the wood. So yes, there's a whole discussion to be had about how far do I sand, but just keep those kind of things I said in mind as food for thought. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is use one of my favorite wood finishes. This is Total Boat Wood Honey. It is a hybrid mix of mineral oil, beeswax, and probably coconut stuff. I don't exactly know what's in here, but it is natural and it does a wicked job of making the resin and wood pop. So I'm going to go ahead and put some gloves on and we're going to get a close up here and you can see just what happens. So when you're doing charcuterie boards, most of the time you're going to be using a natural food safe finish like this Total Boat Wood Honey or like a food safe mineral oil. You're probably not going to be using like a tabletop finish or a spray on urethane or something like that. Sometimes people will flood coat these things, which is to say that they will, coat the entire thing in a coat of clear resin. If you're going to be flood coating, don't sand past 120 grit because that's going to end up, if you sand past 120 grit, you're going to end up getting a lot of separation and stuff when you do your resin pour over it. So again, just keep that in mind. For a charcuterie board that's going to be in contact with food, I almost always prefer an oil finish like this. When you're using that flood coating, yes, it looks amazing and you don't have to do nearly as much sanding because you can get a super polished glass-like look when you're doing a flood coat with very little sanding. It's almost like a cheater way of polishing. However, if you think about the use of a charcuterie board or whatever, if it gets cut or there's a fork or someone's picking something off with a fork or a knife, a piece of charcuterie or cheese or bread or whatever it may be, if it's got a full resin coat, you're going to end up puncturing or at least kind of denting or scratching that resin coat, and it's never going to look the same again. Whereas these, over time, this oil is going to obviously wear off, especially as it gets washed. But you can easily do a quick, very light sand, or whoever owns the board, maybe it's your customer. They can do a very light sand and then apply, wood finish, a natural cutting board oil or a mineral oil that you can get from Amazon or Home Depot or pretty much anywhere else to bring the board back to life. So the key with these natural wood finishes is to kind of let them mellow. You're going to let them sit here. I would give it at least 20 minutes of just that finish sitting on there, giving it enough time for the wood to at least absorb it. Some people will dump these things in a complete mineral oil bath for an hour or even overnight. I think that's a bit excessive. I think 20 minutes, 30 minutes with this stuff and then buffing it off with a lint-free cloth or a whatever buffing device you want to use is sufficient. So I'm going to go wait 20 minutes. We'll come back, we'll buff this up, and we'll finally see our completed projects. These guys have been chilling out for a little bit in the Total Boat Wood Honey. So basically after that period of time where a sufficient amount of that has been absorbed by the wood, you can come and just buff it all off. Just use a lint-free cloth. I use these shop towels. Nothing too particular here. You just want to make sure you get it all buffed out. You might have to do this twice depending on how much kind of residue is left over. But it really just, kind of makes everything pop, as you can see here, right? Like that wood and the resin just look really quite amazing. Well, after all that, we finally have our 2 finished charcuterie boards, which are ready for gifting or sale. I hope you not only enjoyed watching the video, and I hope you learned something, of course, but more than that, I hope you see the benefit of using these pre-shaped charcuterie board forms from craftedelements.com. We have a collection of over 80 silicone molds at Crafted Elements, not just these charcuterie board molds, but if you're a woodworker or a resin artist, I guarantee there's something that will fit your next project. So head over to craftedelements.com now. The link is also in the description below. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you found it informative and useful, I do create project videos every week or two. So make sure you subscribe here on our YouTube channel and make sure you hit that like button because it certainly helps us out a lot. And I will see you in the next one.